Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of the second book of Chronicles, that is Divrei Hayomim Bet. We are about to study chapter 29. We just read of the very sorry, very difficult, very corrupt, and evil reign of King Achaz. We move on to his son, Hezekiah. He's also sometimes called Chizkiah or Chizkiyahu. Here he will be called Yechizkiyahu, but otherwise known as King Hezekiah, who is, for the most part, 99%, a tremendous hero, a person who brought the worship of God and back to the temple and restored almost everything that Achaz had lost, brought the people back to independence from the Assyrian Empire, and someone who's remembered for his great works of engineering. However, at the end, there's a slight twist which we will get to, but we have several chapters to get there. Because Chizkiyahu is such an important king, the chronicler will devote several chapters to his career. Now, the Yechizkiyahu, let's begin with verse 1. This is a pretty long chapter, but because it's pretty much all narrative, it speaks for itself. There isn't a huge amount of commentary that needs to be said. I should be able to read through the entire chapter, and we can study it together in one podcast. So Yechizkiyahu malach ben 25 shana. Chizkiyahu became king when he was 25 years old. Esrim v'teisha shana malach b'Yerushalayim, and he ruled for 29 years in Jerusalem. V'shem imo, and his mother's name was Aviyah bat Zechariyahu. Aviyah, the daughter of Zechariyahu. Vayas hayashor be'enei Adonai, and he did what was proper in the eyes of God. K'chol asher asa David aviv, completely as his grandfather had his ancestor David had done. Hu vashana harishona l'malcho b'chodesh harishon. He, in his first year, in the first month of his reign, in other words, as soon as he took over, the first major thing that he did, Pasach et dalsos beis Adonai vayachaz came. He opened the doors to the temple, to the house of God, vayachaz came, and he fixed them. Right, he strengthened them, he fixed them. Remember, we studied that his father Achaz had locked them up so that people should no longer access the temple. He opened it. That was his first order of business. So now his order of business is to restore the temple, to get rid of all of the damage that had been done by his father, and to rebuild it, restore it, and get the temple service back into order. So vayaveh et haKohanim v'et haLevim, and he brought the priests and the Levites, the Kohanim and the Leviim, vayasfem l'rchov haMizrach, and he gathered them in the eastern Rechov, often is translated as street, but it means like a public platform. So the eastern area, gathering area within on the temple, in the temple compound. Vayomer lohem, and he said to them, Shima'uni halaviim, listen to me, Levites. Ata, now is the time that hiskadshu, you need to, literally it means to sanctify, you sanctify yourselves. In other words, cleanse yourselves of any impurities, any sins. Presumably bathe in a ritual bath. V'kadshu et beit Adonai Eloi avotechem, and you need to sanctify the house of God, the Lord of your fathers, the Lord of your ancestors. V'hotziu et hanidam min hakodesh, and we need to get rid of all things that are disgusting, all things that are minudeh. Nidam means things that are pushed aside from the Kodesh. In other words, because remember, his father had planted all sorts of idolatrous items and impure items throughout the whole Jerusalem, and unfortunately, most tragically, within the temple compound itself. Because our fathers rebelled against God, and they did which was evil in the eyes of God. And they abandoned him. And they turned their faces. Instead of praying towards the temple, praying towards God, they turned their faces. They showed their backs to God, and they turned their faces away from the place where God resides. They closed and locked up the doors to the ulam, is the porch or the portico that leads into the kodesh, into the holy part of the temple. And they doused and they extinguished the lights. In other words, they did not light the menorah anymore. They stopped bringing the incense and burning the incense. Viola lohelu makodesh, and the sacrifices they stopped giving and bringing in the holy temple, Elohei Yisrael, which were supposed to be brought for the God of Israel. And what was the result? Anger. The anger of God against Judah and Jerusalem. And he made us an object of horror, an object of destruction, an object of people Lisreika is to often translated to hiss at. People would say, "Ugh, look at those people. They're just degraded and disgusting." That's what happened. Remember, enemies attacked from all around, destruction all around. That's all it brought. Like you see yourselves, it's time to restore our greatness, restore our honor, and return to God. What was the result? Our forefathers, they died in battle. And because of this, our sons, our daughters, our wives were taken captive by the enemy. Now, it is my purpose to establish a covenant Ladonai Elohei Yisrael with God, the Lord of Israel, v'yashov mimenu charon apo, so that his anger should be stopped, his anger should be taken away from us. Bonai, my children, al tishalu, now do not be lazy, do not slack. Kivochem b'char Adonai, because God has chosen you la'amod lefanav l'sharso, to stand before him and serve him, v'liyos lo misharsimu maktirim, that you should be for him those that serve him and those that bring the ketoret, that burn the incense. So get going. You got a big job ahead. Vayakum Halavim. So the Levites got up, and their leaders are named Machat ben Amosai, V'Yoel ben Azayom, and Bnei Akasi. From the Kahatites, these two men, Bnei Merari, and from the Merarites, Kish ben Avdi, V'Azaryahu ben Yehalelel, Umin Gershonim, from the Gershonites, Yoach ben Zimah, V'Eden ben Yoach. So two leaders from each of the three major Levite families, Umin b'nei Elitzaphan, and from the descendants of Elitzaphan, Shimri v'Yeel, Umin b'nei Asaph, Zecharyahu, Umatanyahu. Those were sub-families. Umin b'nei Haman, and another so in other words, from the maiden families, there was two, and then as it's going to list some of the other families, Umin b'nei Haman, Yechiel v'Shemi, Umin b'nei Yedusun, Shemaiah v'Uziel. So these were the names of the leaders that stood up to the task and heeded the instructions and the command of their king, their new king Chizkiyahu. Vayasu et achehem, and they gathered their brothers, vayiskadshu, and they purified themselves. Vayavo, and they came kimitzvas hamelach, just as the king has commanded b'divrei Adonai, to fulfill the words of God, l'taher beit Adonai, to purify the house of God. Vayavo ha-kohanim lepnima, and the kohanim, the priests, came inside the inner sanctum, Beis Adonai, of the house of God, l'taher, in order to purify it. Vayotziu, and they took out of there et kol hatuma, all of the abominable things, the impure things, asher matzu behechal Adonai, that they found in the heichal, in the house of God, lachatzar beit Adonai, vayekablu haleviim l'hotzi lenachal kidron chutza, and they the Levites were mikabel. They accepted. They took from the kohanim. So in other words, the priests were in the inner parts where the Levites were not supposed to go, but the Levites then took these impure items and brought them down to the Kidron Valley, presumably in order to be destroyed, in order to be gotten rid of. Vayechelu be'echad l'chodesh harishon, and they began all of this on the first day of the first month. So the holiday of Pesach is coming, which we're going to see soon, but it is the first day of the month of Nisan. This is when they began this job to sanctify Yom Shmona l'chodesh, and by the 8th day of the, so they did this for a week, so that by the 8th day of the month, Bo'u l'ulam Adonai, they reached the ulam, the porch that leads into the Heichal, vayikachu es beis Adonai liyamim shmona, and it took them therefore 8 days to be mikadesh, to another 8 days to sanctify and cleanse the inner courtyard, the temple, the Heichal itself. So therefore, it took a total of Yom Shisha Asar L'Chodesh Harishon Kilu. By the 16th day, they were done with all this work. So that was 7 plus 8, of course, is 15. So that by day 16, they're done. So this is, of course, the holiday of Pesach, and we'll see how they dealt with that soon. How the first Pesach after cleansing the temple was celebrated, that we will get to shortly. That will be a major story, but let's hold off on that discussion for a moment and let the chronicler tell us the story. Vayavo Pnima, and they came into the inner sanctum, El Chizkiyahu Hamelach. They came to the inner palace. I mean, this is not the inner sanctum. I said sanctum, but I meant the throne room of Hezekiah the king. Vayomer, and they said, Tiharnu et kol beit Adonai, we have purified the entire house of God, et mitbacha olah, the altar of the sacrifices, we had kol kelav and all of its utensils, we had shulchan hamarechet, and the table of showbread, we had kol kelav and all the utensils that are related to it, we had kol hakelim asher hizniach hamelech hachaz b'malchuso, and all of the vessels that Achaz had abused during his kingdom b'ma'alo, right, when he was rebelling against God. Heichanu, we repaired them, v'hikdoshnu, and we sanctified them, v'hinam lifnei mizbach Adonai, and they are all laid out nicely, ready to be used, laid out before God's altar. Vayashkei Chizkiyahu hamelach, so Chizkiyahu woke up early in the morning, Vayasofet Sarei Ha'ir Vayal Beit Adonai, and he gathered all the leaders of the city, and he went up to the temple of God. And now that it is ready, it is holy, it is purified, it is time to begin the services and to begin worship of the proper worship of God in the temple. And this was begun with a series of sacrifices. Vayaviu Parim Shiva Ve'elim Shiva. They brought 7 cows, 7 rams, Kvasim Shiva, and 7 sheep, Utzvire Izim Shiva Lechatas, and 7 goats as sin offerings al hamamlacha, as sin offerings over the kingdom which had previously rebelled, so to ask for forgiveness from God, bi'al hamigdash, and over the abuse of the temple itself, bi'al Yehuda, and over the corrupt leadership over the people of Judah. Vayomer livnei Aaron haKohanim, and he told to the sons of Aaron, the Kohanim, the priests, lahalos al mizbach Adonai, that go ahead and bring these sacrifices upon God's altar. Vayishchatu habakar, and they slaughtered the cattle, as the cattle that we listed before. Vayekablu haKohanim et hadam, and the priests caught the blood, which is one of the jobs of the priest. Vayizruku hamizbecha, and it was sprinkled upon the altar. Vayishchatu ha'elim, and they slaughtered the rams. Vayizruku adam hamizbecha, and that was also brought to the altar. Vayishchatu ha'kvasim, vayizruku adam hamizbecha, and that same thing with the sheep. All the blood was brought to the altar. Vayagishu et tzirei achatos lifnei hamelech v'alcohol, and then the goats which were set aside as sin offerings were brought before the king. Vayismuchu yidehem aleihem, and the people leaned upon them. This was a practice that was done with a sin offering, where the person leans upon the animal and says vidoy, and admits and openly mentions the sins that they are guilty of, and asks for God through this worship, through this repentance, to forgive them. So this was done by the king himself and the leadership of the congregation. Vayishchatuma Kohanim, and then the priests went and slaughtered the sin offerings. Vayachatu es damam hamizbecha, and they brought their blood upon the altar, l'chaper al kol Yisrael, in order to bring forgiveness to all of Israel, ki l'chol Yisrael amar hamelech ha'olah v'yachatos, because the king said that this olah, this sacrifice and this sin offering was for the entire people of Israel to present themselves before God to ask forgiveness for their past misdeeds. And he stood up the Levites, who's also, of course, their job is to sing and play music, together with the avoda, together with the service in the temple, b'mitzvas David, as God, as the David had commanded. And God Jose Hamelach, and God, who was the seer, the prophet of the king back in David's time, Vinason Hanavi, and Nathan, who was the prophet also back in David's time. If you remember, when we studied the life of David together, at his time there were two prophets mentioned in conjunction with David's reign, and that is Gad and Nasan or Natan. Kiviyad Adonai HaMitzvah Biyad Neviyav, because this commandment, right, was given by God through his prophets, that the Nevi'im, that the Levites should be the ones that lead in song. Vayamdu haLeviim b'chlei David, and the Levites stood with the vessels, and this means vessels here, actually, the instruments, the musical instruments of David, v'hakohanim b'chatzotzrot, and the priests were blowing on trumpets. So apparently they still had, at the time, some of the instruments that were David's own instruments. That would be the simple meaning, or it could just mean that instruments being played in the temple are called the instruments of David after him. Vayomer Chizkiyahu. So Chizkiyahu, the king, said, "L'halos olah mizbeach." It is time to bring this olah, the sacrifice, on the temple, on the altar. Uve'es heichel ha'olah, heichel shir Adonai v'yachatzotzros. And when it came time to begin the olah, right, they also began the singing. To begin bringing the sacrifice, they began the singing and the trumpets, Val Yedei Klei David Melech Yisrael, and they used again the instruments of David, the king of Israel. V'chol hakol mishtachvim, and all the people that were gathered were bowing. V'yashir mishorer, and the singers are singing. V'achatzotzrotz machzirim, and the trumpets are blowing. Hakol ad l'chlos ha'olah, and they did this all throughout until the olah was completely brought, until sacrifice was completed. Ukichalos laha'alos, and when they completed the process of the sacrifice, koru hamelach, the king bowed down. The image of the king bowing before God is crucial here, as opposed to the image we had in the beginning of the chapter of the king turning his back on God. And all that were with him, and they all bowed and prostrated themselves before God. Vayomer Chizkiyahu hamelach, and Chizkiyahu the king said, V'hasorim l'Leviim, right? And he told this to the Hashorim and the singers, right? To the Levites, Lahalel Adonai, he ordered them to sing and sing praise to God, b'divrei David, by using the words of David, v'asaf hachozeh. We know Asaph, the prophet, so we know that many of the Psalms are attributed to David, many are attributed to Asaph. And he told them to use these psalms to sing praise to God, v'halalu ad l'simcha, and they sang and gave praise until the joy and the happiness grew among the people, vayikdu vayishtachavu, and they bowed and prostrated themselves before God. Vaya'an Yechizkiyahu, and Yechizkiyahu then announced, Vayomer, and he said, Ata, now milesem yedchem ladonai, you have literally, this translates to, you have filled up your hands for God. What it really means is you have consecrated yourself, which is really the best translation that I've seen, right? In other words, you have now given your hands this task. They are now officially ready to be used. You have the license now, so to speak. That is now your job, and you have now completed your requirements, and you have that responsibility. Goshu, so therefore go approach, right? And we're going to continue this. It's time to bring more sacrifices and sacrifices of thanks and gratitude to the temple. Vayaviu hakahol zvachim v'todos, and the people that were gathered there then began to bring. So in other words, the first process was led by the king, done by the priests and the Levites, in order to bring about a rapprochement of sorts between the people and God. Now it's time to get into the business of regular worship, right? So people began to bring their sacrifices and their offerings of thanks. V'chol nediv leiv, and anyone who had the movement in his heart, the feeling in his heart that it was time, olot, would bring sacrifices, burnt offerings. Vayhi mispar ha'olah asher hiviu alcohol, and many, the numbers became great. The numbers of burnt sacrifices that the congregation brought. Bakar Shivim was 70 cattle, Elim Mea, 100 rams, Kvasim Asayim, 200 sheep, La'ola Ladonai Kolela. Those were all brought as Ola, as burnt sacrifices. But there was more of the Kadashim, other holy sacrifices, Bakar Sheish Meos, 600 cattle, Vitzon Shlosh Salafim, and 3,000 sheep. Rakakoanim Hayu Lamad. However, there wasn't enough priests that had shown up for this process. It seems like many of the priests weren't involved. Maybe they weren't so enthusiastic. And part of the process is skinning the olos, the burnt sacrifices, and they didn't have enough of them to do it. So the Levites helped them out until they were able to complete all the work. And until the priests more priests were able to sanctify themselves and join. Because in this time, the Levites were the ones that were straight of heart. They were more enthusiastic. They were more conscientious about getting the job done, Kadesh, to sanctify the temple more than the priests themselves. Because aside from the many, many burnt sacrifices, and there was also other jobs to do. They had the other sacrifices that weren't totally burnt, right, were the shlamim, the peace offerings, right, which are generally consumed by the people that bring them, but there's still portions of it that needed to be brought to the altar, vanesachim, laola, and they had the libations, vatikot, and all the things that go along with the service. The Levites had to help out and chip in because the Kohen and the priests didn't have enough manpower until they built up their manpower. Vatikon avodas beis Adonai, and so because of the Levites' help, the worship in the temple of God was done properly. Vayismach, and this is the end of the first chapter on the reign of Hezekiah in Chronicles. Vayismach Hezekiah v'chol and Hezekiah, Hezekiah, and all of the nation were very happy. Al ha'hechin ha'elohim la'am, on that which God had given them the chance, the opportunity to properly worship, right? That he had given that opportunity to the nation. Ki b'fisom hayadavar, because this thing happened suddenly. In other words, Hezekiah didn't put a huge amount of time in preparing. Immediately, upon becoming king, he gave the people this monumental task, and it was done pitom, so suddenly, but they managed to achieve it nonetheless. The remarkable achievement of getting the temple service back off the ground, getting the people to rededicate themselves to God, the happiness and the celebrations were wonderful. So we hear about Hezekiah, setting the people back on the right path, trying to repair the damage that his father Achaz had done. We will continue to read the life and career of Hezekiah, its ups and its downs, in the next several chapters, as we rapidly progress towards the end of the kingdom of Judah. But before we get to the end, we have some bright spots, and right now we're fortunately in the middle of one of those major bright spots, which is the beginning of the reign of Hezekiah and all of the hope and promise that it brought. Thank you so much for studying together with me. Looking forward to continuing to study the book of Chronicles until its completion, and of course many, many more books together until we complete all the works of the prophets. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.